What's up, Proteus Academy coming at you? Anyway, I went to a tournament this last weekend and I watched some debates. I watched some open debates, some elimination round debates, and I was not particularly impressed even by these teams that were advancing fairly deep into elimination rounds. And I tried to kind of figure out why that was. And that motivated me to make this video, which I am titling How to Win Debates 10 Reasons You Haven't Reached the Top Level. And I'm hoping this will kind of serve as a companion for the video on the channel, How to Get Better at Debate, because I do think these are two different concepts. I think there's, like, obviously, if you do the things in this video, I think you'll get better at debate. But at the same time, I think this one is less about, like, specific drills or things you can learn that will make you better, and more so about mindsets or just things you're probably not even thinking about strategically or whatever that could help you in that regard. And so I want to go ahead and get right into it. The first thing before we get to anything else, that's what first means, uh, is a quotation. And that quotation is, "You are what your record says you are," by Bill Parcells. And Bill Parcells was an NFL coach, and I think this is true. I think that over any reasonable sample size, and let's say that is, I don't know, 3 tournaments. Over 3 tournaments, whatever those 3 tournaments say, that's probably who you are as a competitor. Now, you might have one bad tournament in there, but if you have 3 bad tournaments in there, you're not that good at debate, and you're certainly not at the top level. And so I think a lot of people have this idea of like, oh, I just didn't debate well this time around, or they're kind of letting the history of their peak or their memory or whatever, their own bias, inform how good they are. And that is holding them back from improving. So I wanted to put together a list of things that I think those kinds of people don't work on to improve. So, number one, the number one reason you're not at the top level is because you don't exploit errors. And I want to talk about what I mean by errors and break it down into 2 components. That would be unforced errors and a forced error. So, first things first, what is an error? Obviously, an error is when you make a mistake. An error in the context of a debate is when you do something that decreases your likelihood of winning the round, or that potentially could outright lose you the round. And when we get to this distinction between an unforced error and a forced error, what we are talking about is why you made that mistake. An unforced error is where the opponent didn't do anything that caused you to make that mistake. So I watched a debate this weekend where the AF was like AI law enforcement, and the NAG was disadvantaged. The entire criminal justice system is racist and terrible, so AI will be racist and terrible too, with a counter plan of ban AI and give $10 billion to the cops. And I'm just sitting there like, what? Like the look on my face was just baffled, because it's like that counter plan links harder to their own disad than the AF does. And honestly kind of just like straight turns itself. Like the entire premise of the app is cops are so racist that even their robots will be racist. And then you read a counterplan that was give the racist people a bunch of money. And that to me is an unforced error. No one made them do that. This is something they came up with in their own prep or in the moment. It wasn't because the other team went so fast or was so technical or was so smart. This team just made a mistake that could essentially cost them the debate in their first speech before the other teams even had a chance to respond to it. And that's a great example of an unforced error. So that brings us to, what is a forced error? A forced error is when you do something that makes the other team make a mistake. Now, there's a lot of ways this could occur. This could be that you're too fast for them, and so they're just dropping arguments. This could be that you're reading really sophisticated arguments that they don't understand, or you're hiding a trick somewhere in your case that they don't understand and they mishandle that argument. And now they've decreased their odds of winning. They've kind of given you something that you could translate into winning the debate. What I'm trying to say more broadly with errors is, I just feel like I watch debates all of the time, even in open, even at a fairly high level, that either team essentially could just win. by just repeating things their opponent said because they're reading defense to their own case. They're straight turning their own case. They're just reading nonsense arguments that actually hurt them rather than helping them. And in my experience, a ton of people just don't even see when this is happening. And I think that's incredibly problematic. So that's number one. You are not exploiting errors. The last thing I guess I'll say here is, to me, this is something that the good open debaters do. And it's kind of a drill I used to do before I came to DVC when I would work with the DVC kids, which is I would debate them, and I was significantly higher level than all of them. And so I would try and beat them by only going for arguments they didn't answer. Like if they answered an argument, I just pretend it didn't exist and then see if I could still beat them just by going for things they dropped. And I think that that kind of illustrates this concept. They had made a mistake that won me the debate. Number two, you refuse to choose. And this kind of has three components to it. What I mean here is you're not picking an impact. You're not picking a strategy. You're just going for everything all of the time. And there is a select handful of teams where that is an effective strategy. And generally speaking, it's not that the strategy is effective. It is that you're just so much better than your opponent that they can't technically keep up with you, and then you can smoke them, right? This is very much like the Berkeley strat for a long time. When I say refusing to choose, I've got three subpoints here. The first subpoint is round vision, and this is so important, maybe the most important thing in debate, and incredibly difficult to teach. Round vision is the idea of being able to see across pages, being able to understand how different arguments in the debate interact, and, crucially, being able to identify a strategy that can win you the round, right? So being able to see that if we just go for this position or just go for this impact or this internal link scenario, we've got a winner on our hands. The B subpoint here is about effective kicks. I cannot handle how much time I see wasted in debates by teams who are going to kick a position or in the process of kicking a position and are just burning time. If I was kicking out of like a topicality, it might be, in slow motion. It would sound something like this. Extend the we meet. We're not going for the topicality. There's no offense on this sheet. We're going for the disad. Like that's everything. That might be everything I would say, generally speaking. On a disad, extend the no link. No link takes out the link turn. No residual offense on the sheet. We're not going for it. Moving on. But I see teams spending like a minute and a half because they're so scared they're going to lose on like an RVI or something. And they just never do, right? They just never do, because what they've done instead is, by wasting time, they created a time trade-off for the other team, and then the other team can exploit that on a different position to be able to win. It's a funny story from my first year at Mile High, where this judge, Joe Allen, was judging some team, and I think they spent like 2 minutes in the MO on topicality, and then they went, but we're not even going for that. And Joe Allen stood up and was like, then why it's just like, so that kind of thing. You have to be efficient at your kicks. Get rid of things as fast as possible so that you can spend your time, and again, time is the most important resource, on things that actually matter. The CISA point is checklist, and we're going to see an example of this, but what I'm trying to say here is people just don't have a series of protocols for how they will answer things. They just wait till that thing shows up, and then they wing it, or they figure it out, and I think that's virtually always incredibly inefficient. I think that you want to have a systematized approach to how you will answer the most common positions you can expect to hear. I'll show you 2 examples. This is the model, more or less, that I tell my students for how to answer topicality. We meet / impossible to meet, counter interpretation. I also tell them to read a we meet to the counter interpretation. Our interpretation is good. That is a reason to prefer your interpretation on the standards level. Your interpretation is bad. This is a disad standard, essentially, against the interpretation of the other team. Don't vote on potential abuse. It's like voting on potential disad. Reasonability. And when I was an MG, I would write down the things you see on that funnel. WM, CI, OG, YB, potential abuse, reasonability, just like that. Just so that I knew to go through those as a checklist. And topicality is very much a position that's just about time trade-offs, right? Especially in Parley. Like, if you can answer topicality thoroughly in a minute or less, the other team's just not going to go for it most of the time. Now, if it takes you 2 minutes, either they feel like you're not answering that great, or you've answered it too much and they've won a time trade-off somewhere else and they can exploit that. Topicality, condo, these are the kind of positions where mostly what you're trying to do is win a time trade-off on either side of the equation. Another example, answering counterplans. When you answer counterplan, really, I think there's only 4 things you really need to do. That's read a permutation, explain why the counterplan links to the disad if that's possible, read a solvency deficit to the counterplan. Why does your AF solve more than the counterplan? Why does the counterplan solve less than the AF? And then read any independent offense you have, which could be your own new disad, it could be a turn, etc., etc. This is very similar to how you could answer a K alternative, except for you probably want like a perm swamps to links. You could also make that argument on the disad depending on how it functions. But bottom line, like, you need a protocol. You need to know how you're going to approach something. Because really what this is about is knowing when you have answered it enough. And this is what a lot of people struggle with. They just either read too many arguments or too few arguments because they don't have a protocol in mind. So that brings us to number 3. You haven't specialized. And this is actually a major part of why I made this video. The least viewed video, fun fact for you Proteus trivia buffs, the least viewed video on this channel is titled Narrow Your Range. It was one of the first videos me and Sasan ever did almost 4 years ago. And it was based on this poker video that I had watched. And in this video, this guy essentially says, you want to stop losing so much at poker, especially in your home game? Narrow your range. And what he means is, if you're not good at poker, you can't read people. You can't figure out the odds in the pot. You don't know the statistical analysis, like the top level play. So the only way you win is anytime you're heads up with someone, you have the better cards, right? You have the stronger hand. And the way you do that is by narrowing the range of hands you play. So when I say you haven't specialized, what I'm trying to say is pick something that is your wheelhouse and get good at it. I see so many people who try and be good at everything or who haven't really cultivated any kind of strength. And I think it's great to be a well-rounded debater, but you need to have a strength. You need to have something, whether that's disadvantages, counterplan debate, criticism debate, theory debate, whatever it might be, that if you're against a team that is generally of a similar level to you, you will now have an advantage. You have something you can kind of always go for. I think the problem I see is a lot of people end up feeding into that you can't choose thing because they don't have a comfort zone, right? When me and Dallas were debating, we wanted to go for topicality. We wanted to go for long form framework. We wanted to go for econ or Russia disadvantages. We wanted to say the AF was a good idea. We wanted to read neoliberalism. And if we could do any of those things against you, we felt really, really good. Brenna and Tristan last year, if they could read Marx against you or read T against you or read Kondo against you, they felt really, really good. You have to have something you specialize in, something that is a strength, because at minimum, it keeps the other team honest. It makes them have to think about dealing with that thing rather than just dealing with a straight up case or something of that nature. Number 4, you never adapt. I see so many students, and I'm on panels, and I look around the panel, and the way these students debate is making no goddamn sense to me. You need to learn about your judges. You need to read their judge philosophies. You need to ask your coach about how they judge debates. B, you need to read the room, especially in parley and policy debate. The person who is not speaking should frequently be looking up at the judge or the judges to see if they're following or not. Because I frequently see kids just staring down, shit spreading, and the judges in the back of the room not even holding their pen, not paying attention, they're like rubbing their head or something, and no one seems to have even noticed, right? Like, again, there's a human being in the back of the room, not a robot, and so seeing how they're reacting can make a big difference in your level of success. And then the last thing is the golden rule, and let me show you the golden rule. The golden rule of adaptation. If you don't know the judge, assume they are bad. I have had to have this conversation with my students so many times, and they never want to listen. But here's the thing, right? Theoretically, your coach, if they're experienced, knows just about all of the judges on the circuit in some capacity. They debated in front of them, they're friends with them, they followed their careers, whatever that might be. And so what I tell my kids is, if I have never heard of this person, they're almost certainly not very good at debate, because if they were good, I would know who they are because I'd have judged them or I'd have seen them or they'd have been a judge. And the only exception to that is when people are coming over from other debate events But even in that case, there's a lot of things that don't translate. Like a really good PF judge judging parlay, I don't know how great that is. Same thing with policy judges. They just judge the debate differently than you're used to. And so you should be hoping to simplify. You should potentially be going slower depending on who your judge is. You shouldn't be having all these kind of parlay specific crazy things. Policy judges don't have to flow analytics that frequently. Neither do LD judges. And so adapt based on that. And just, again, if you don't know who the judge is, just assume they don't know what they're doing. And so make their job as easy as possible. That brings us to number 5, which is you suck at prep. That's kind of self-explanatory, but there's 2 things I want to talk about here. The ASA point is writing your own arguments. The number of kids who can't prep themselves or who don't have round vision or can't execute a strategy because they just never write their own arguments is exceedingly high. I would say that this is definitely a challenge that my students have faced in the past because I like to write a lot of stuff where maybe it's like even holding them back because I write so much stuff and they don't have to do it themselves. Not calling anyone out in particular. And the bottom line is when you write a lot of arguments, you start to understand debate a lot better potentially, or at least you know you have something that you can fall back on. I was talking to Alex and Gabe, the Oregon boys national champions MPTE last year, and they didn't do like a single practice round their senior year when they won nationals because all they did was just write arguments and they still were really good. There's a certain point where like you have all these technical skills and the question becomes like, do you have the ammunition you need in order to be successful in these rounds? So that brings you to the BISA point. Practice prep. And there's a difference here, right? Writing your own arguments is like you have weeks and months or whatever to write your K, write your T, etc., etc., etc. But in parlay, obviously you only get 20 minutes or 30 minutes. And you need to practice coming up with arguments for any given topic in that time period. Practice having multiple strategies. Figure out who in your partnership is going to be doing what, assuming you're in a partnered format of debate. Prep, again, is a skill. People don't want to practice it, but it makes a big difference. There's no way a team that knows how to prep is reading like terminal defense or like a disad to their own encounter plan. It's because they relied on the prep of others and then tried to pivot. Number 6, you can't keep up. And I want to make it clear that I think there's a difference here between the concepts of listening and the concepts of flowing. There are a ton of people who can flow pretty well, right? They can write down all the words or they can write down the tags or whatever. But I think that is distinct from just listening to what is being said. Because for myself, I've really cultivated that listening skill. And so like I had a fine flow, whatever, I could handle just about any debate I was in. But more importantly, because I had the ability to listen, I just noticed when people made bad arguments and it made my flowing more effective. Like to this day when I'm judging, like when someone says something that's like really dumb, I just instantly highlight it and I'm just hoping someone will mention that thing later in the debate and then they virtually never do. So I think that you need to be an active listener when people are speaking in the debate, not just flowing, because that's the kind of thing that spurs you to be able to say something to your partner before the next speech, like, hey, make sure you get that turn or whatever. On that note, I was hanging out with Oregon this weekend at a tournament, and me, Alex, and Gabe were watching this debate. And in this debate, the AF read this like AFK, and it got to the bottom, and they were reading this like AF framework thing on the bottom. And I turned to Alex, and I was like, 100% what's going to happen in this next speech is that the LOC is not going to answer like these 2 to 4 arguments out of the 6 on framework, and then they're going to have like a way harder time judging this debate. And Alex like, oh yeah, absolutely, this is going to happen. And then that pretty much was what happened. The other team didn't get to the framework arguments until there was like 40 seconds left, and they only answered like 2 of them. And if they had answered those arguments first, they would have just been so far ahead of the game. But it was almost like they just weren't aware of what actually mattered in the debate. But to me and Alex, it was incredibly clear, right? Before the other team had even had a speech, we figured like this is the most important thing. This team's probably going to drop it because of the location it's been put in, because they're just not keen on that. And I think that the best debaters can do that. They just know what is going to matter later on in the debate, and as a result, they address it. Because like if you're addressing every single argument, that's cool if you're like super sick and Tom Katie, but you're probably not. And so really, you're just not getting coverage where you actually need it. Number 7, you are majoring in the minors. And what I mean by this is you are focusing on things that are not high expected value. Expected value is this idea of like probability versus outcome, which is to say, you're putting a lot of effort into things that are just not going to come up in debates that often. Like, yes, maybe every once in a while someone is going to read Sunset Clause theory against you, but if you're putting any significant amount of time into that, I think that's just a bad decision. I think you need to be able to read an AF and defend it. You need to be able to read disas. You need to be able to read counterplans. You need to be able to answer condo. You need to be answer topicality, go for topicality, read AK, answer the Ks, etc. But instead, a lot of people end up focusing on these hyper specific things, right? Like, oh, it's like this one specific semio cap, blah 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 K, or like hauntology or whatever it might be. And those things are only going to appear in a very small amounts of your debate. So if you're like, how do I win greater than, I don't know, 70% of my rounds? The answer is be really good at the things that are going to come up in 70% of your rounds. Number 8, you suck at practice. Three things here. First one is showing up prepared. The amount of times I've had students show up to practice with no paper, no pen, not on time, not able to be there for the full duration. They just want to chit chat and have fun and stuff. And that has meant we only got one round in or part of one round in instead of 2 or 3 is overwhelming. And obviously I'm a community college professor, so it's a little bit different. At Pacific, you showed up and you just started doing debates. But I guess my point is just like, don't come to practice unless you're there to practice, because you're wasting other people's times and you're not going to get much better, assuming you do want to be good. The BSA point is fix it, focus practice. You need to pick something you are practicing, preferably something that you've struggled with, and then work on being better at that thing. A lot of people in practice, kind of going into the CISA point, are just playing. They're just doing a debate and it's ha 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 ha, or having so much fun, instead of trying to get better. There's this concept of playing versus practice in like music, right? Like you're playing the guitar, you're just noodling around and having fun, versus you're actually working on developing some technique, some theory, or some skill. And I think that the only effective use of practice effectively is to get better. And so if you're not going into practice with your mind having a goal in it, you're going to struggle. I would also say this kind of ties into that concept I've discussed before of like just winning debates in practice. Like that's your goal, is to beat your teammates who are worse than you, and how that doesn't make you any better. The only way you get better is if you challenge yourself, or if you work to develop the skill set that's necessary for you to win rounds. And so don't necessarily take the easy path, take the hard path so that you can improve. Number 9, you're not resolving arguments. And I want to talk about the concepts of resolution versus impact calculus here. Most people seem to think resolving arguments means you say, we're winning magnitude and probability. Magnitude always matters most because of blah, 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 blah. Probability always matters most because of blah, 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 blah. That is distinct from argument resolution. Argument resolution is when there are competing claims being made on a given sheet of paper or on a given section of a sheet of paper, and you tell the judge how they should resolve those claims so that they don't do it however they want to do it. I think this is what leads to judges, and I would say it certainly leads to myself occasionally, making decisions that like people aren't necessarily stoked on, because I'm like, all right, well, actually it's funny, I was talking to Gabe about this the other day, because Gabe's philosophy like literally says like, hey, if you don't do this impact calculus thing, here's how I'm going to do it for you. And that might not go your way. So the bottom line is you need to tell the judge how to resolve the arguments. How should they make their decision? What should they be prioritizing, etc., and be doing the impact calculus. That brings us to number 10, the final reason you're not at the top level of debate. You suck at taking criticism. I think this is a huge one for a number of students. First sub point here is a lack of self-awareness. The amount of students that come back to me after a round convinced they crushed it. Like just absolutely convinced they crush it. And they're definitely going to break. And that everyone else in the debate was dumb. And the judge was dumb too. And so was their opponent. And so on and so forth. Is very high. And I just think that's a lack of self-awareness. I've had very few students who are actually good at saying, I'm pretty sure I won this round or I lost this round, and they were correct. You need to accept how good you actually are and understand how good other people are if you want to improve. The beast of point is listening to judges. If you're not writing down the things your judges say during the RFD, I don't know why you stayed in the room, because that's the only way you're going to know how to get that judge's ballot. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying you need to listen to that judge in every round you go into, because they might suck, right? They might not be that good at debate. I tell my kids that I don't really care about ballots for the most part, because, like, I don't know, I think I know how to coach debate, and I think a lot of people don't. So there's very few people whose ballots I actually care about reading. But if you're going to be judged by that person, you want to know how to win in front of them specifically. What kind of things can you do for them, even if it's not going to be a general carryover? Because again, your goal theoretically is to win as many debates as possible. If you're going to be like a 90% plus win rate debater, only way to do that is by winning like just about every single person, regardless of how bad they are at judging. And then finally is just listening to your coach. I have been a part of prep rooms, my own, the prep rooms of others. I have seen a lot of students debate and talk to their coaches about it. And I quite frequently have seen coaches be like, hey, here's exactly what the other team is going to say. Here's what you should say. And then have their teams just go like completely off book. Or have their coaches tell them, like, hey, you're going to lose if you keep doing this kind of thing. We got to stop relying on the strategy. And then they keep relying on that strategy and they lose because of this. I guess my philosophy is sort of like, if you have a coach and you like actually care about them as a coach, which hopefully is the case, why wouldn't you listen to them? The entire point of having a coach is so that they can tell you what to do and how to improve and things of that nature. And like, if you're better than your coach, which I think is rare for the vast majority of people, like you should still be able to at least glean some kind of insight from the things they say. I think that just because someone's worse than you at debate doesn't mean they don't have something valuable to tell you, especially because they don't have kind of the ego filter that you do for your own opinion of yourself. So bottom line, you need to be able to listen to the people around you to be able to get better and to know how to get better. So those are the 10 reasons I would say you're not at the top level. And those are the 10 things you should change if you want to win more debates. Thanks, folks.